Welcome to the OneCast vodcast with David and Mason, sponsored by One Mob.
This continues to be a year of virtual outreach, and One Mob wants to help you make that experience better. Introducing One Mob, the fastest way to create engaging and personalized experiences for your viewers, and no coding required. A better experience equals a better result. Start for free today.
Hello, everyone. This is David, and you're listening to the OneCast podcast, the show that connects sales wisdom to practical life for those who love the power of relationships. Today, we're promoting a future webinar.
Recording in progress.
All right. You ready to get started?
Yeah.
That wasn't so convincing.
Yes. Yep, we're good.
All right. All right. Welcome, everybody, to OneCast. I'm David, and of course, I've got here Mason with me, and we're diving into a concept here and a new thing here for our podcast is we're actually going to be promoting something at the very end. So listen to the end to figure out what we're promoting. It's not just One Mob, which we've alluded to not so subtly so many times.
Not so subtly. You're right.
But I mean, at the beginning of our podcast anyway, we give a commercial for One Mob because they are our sponsor. But anyway, we're here to discuss about revenue growth. And we've got several questions on that we're going to talk through today. Big thing that I want to focus on at first here, Mason, is this question right here. So how can salespeople be visible to their prospects in the modern selling environment?
I think that there are a number of tools out there. Modern selling has definitely changed from the way it was even just 10, 20 years ago. I think that there are a couple of tools that really help you stand out, especially in today's more modern selling environment. One of them is social media. And I think that social media is really starting. It's not just starting, it's been, things like LinkedIn have been around for a while, but I think that, studies are showing that leads that are being generated from social media actually tend to be more likely to convert because they tend to focus more on the connection between people rather than the brand. And that's what people really gravitate to, especially when they're going through like a buying scenario, is they are looking at what their experience was like with the person that's selling to them. So, if you go out and buy a car, I can tell you from personal experience, when I was going out to buy a car for my wife, we went to one dealership that was very well known in the area. And the guy we worked with was horrible, just horrible. To the point where he was telling, we told him what car we were interested in. And he would say things like, man, I'm just really not a fan of that type of car. I'm a truck guy. I just love my trucks. And he would talk about trucks. And we're just sitting here going, yeah, great. Thanks so much for making me feel like what I'm getting is a poor product. And it was just a very poor experience because he almost made it feel like he was belittling us for wanting a sedan rather than a truck. And it's like, that's what my wife wants. She wants a sedan. And so when you're working with a buyer, you need to make sure that you're giving them an experience that is a positive experience, not just based on your personal preferences, but preferences of the buyer. And that's something we're going to be getting to later on in this podcast, but it's just, that's why I feel like social media is really starting to make an impact, because before you even connect with the brand necessarily, you're connecting with a person. And when you finally do decide to go through the buying process, you have a better sense of the person you would be working with. So I think that there's a lot to be said for creating a social media presence and getting your sellers on social media so that they can start to establish themselves as a trustworthy individual. And then, the other thing is just to use some kind of tool in that initial outreach that also helps you stand out beyond just social media. For example, utilizing video and microsites like we've talked about in some of our previous podcasts. I think that there is a very big shift towards, video and microsites as opposed to traditional email. People are starting to see the benefit of putting themselves on camera. And again, this goes back to, making that connection with a person as opposed to a brand, because when you send a text-based email, the only thing the only thing the reader really gets is who the brand is. You're probably got a signature at the bottom of your email that says, who your name, but who you're working for, and your company logo probably somewhere located in that signature as well. Whereas when you send a video, you are putting yourself and your persona into that message as well, and they get a sense of who it is that they would be working with if they were to reach out to you. So I think that doing things to separate yourself and using tools like video and microsites to make the engagement process easier, and then also utilizing social media. This is all about becoming more personable and making the connection at a personal level rather than just a brand level.
That totally makes sense. It's funny is while you were talking about that, I was thinking about the whole goal of our podcast, which is that idea of relationships. I think we really tie back to that a lot when we have these conversations. Funny.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I said, it's just I did not. Obviously, if you haven't guessed, I did not buy a car from that individual.
No
not
kidding.
Because the cars they had were bad or anything like that. We ended up buying the same brand of car, but I went to a different dealership 100%. I said, I can find somebody who's going to be to give me a better experience.
Yeah.
So I went to one dealership. I went to one Ford dealership, had a terrible experience with the person, and I ended up going to just a different Ford dealership because I wanted to have a better experience. So yeah, this is a lot about relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And that poor experience you had with that salesperson, he probably didn't have a very good leadership team, or at least one that didn't hold him accountable.
Who knows? Maybe that particular method has served him in the past. That's all we can say is whatever he did, maybe that works with other people. Maybe obviously when somebody who wants to buy a truck, go with that guy because they'll connect about their love for trucks. But it's like for somebody like me who was just looking for a more, I guess I'll call it basic car. It was not the right fit at all.
So if we get back to talking about, sellers trying to stand out, other than your car dealer, those sort of leaders, how do they get across that need to leverage social selling?
Well, I think that it's not just on the sales managers to push social selling. I think social selling almost sells itself, but it's to help your sellers understand the benefits that they will receive from just having that social presence. And a lot of people are on social media these days, so I don't think that there's necessarily a lot that you need to do to convince them that social media helps you to reach a broader audience. We know that's what it does. I think it's about understanding how social media is going to benefit you in other ways. So like we were talking about, the chance for a better overall connection between you and the potential buyer, that's one big key element of it. If you do get somebody to go through the buying process and you generated them that lead through social media, you're probably going to have a higher likelihood that they will convert to a paying customer. Aside from that, social media also offers a lot greater potential for things like referrals. I mean, think about how many times you went and bought something because a friend of yours or somebody that you trusted referred you to that particular organization.
Absolutely.
Just having that initial connection of, yeah, somebody, a really good friend of mine whom I trust told me to come here. You've got them in the bag already. You'd have to do a pretty poor job in order to lose that potential there, at least from a relationship perspective. Maybe they determine after you go through the process, maybe there's another reason that they can't turn into a paying customer. It's like, I really like what you're doing. It's just, as we were going through it, I determined that now's just not the right time. My budget's not there, or maybe I have a little bit more time, but I'll come back to you. We've heard that before.
Right.
But I think that social media gives us the opportunity for better referrals. Social media is also a greater bang for your buck. We're talking about how it hits a broader audience. It's a tool that reaches more people with a combination of like omni-channel media, meaning that you can put things like video, audio, text, a whole bunch of different things to advertise yourself. And the fact is that social media is free. So why wouldn't you be taking advantage of it? So I think that the only thing it costs is a little bit of time. And quite frankly, with how easy it is to engage in social media, the time commitment is not that much. So if you're not using social media, there's almost not an argument against it. It's not a huge commitment of time. There's no financial investment necessary unless you go with one of their paid platforms. Which do have its benefits. Don't let me put aside the benefits of a paid platform, but it's not necessary to get started. And then it allows you to just appear more unique. Like for a business website, they have to focus on the company and the brand and the products and services, but it doesn't let you, in most cases, separate yourself on things that are happening behind the business. For example, maybe times that you've gone out as a company and performed like community engagement, volunteering, going out and doing like, a kid's food basket or something like that. Those are things that you tend to share on social media and just let the business community know that you are devoted to your community or you're devoted to helping and doing good. And those are things that tend to get posted on social media rather than a website, because there isn't quote unquote room for them all the time on a website. So if you are a business that is very active with regards to community engagement, it really would benefit you to have a social media presence for your sellers so that they can continuously go out and demonstrate the good that you are doing for your local area. Or, not necessarily just volunteering, but anything else that's happening behind the scenes, parties that you have, the leadership throwing a party for the team because they did such a great job. Just showing the humanity behind the brand.
I have 30,000.
Excuse me. This is my phone going off. So yeah, I would say that having that social media presence is incredibly important, and I think that it would not be very difficult for you to get your sellers to at least develop that social media presence because of how easy it is. Had to turn off my phone here to make sure it's not going to go off again.
Yeah, no worries. So,
alrighty.
So yeah, you talk about being able to get to kind of find people through social media and how easy it is to use and find people. But as like a seller, what should you look for within a potential customer to know if they're going to buy? So they're like the right people to look for.
Yeah. I've read lots of articles on these things, a lot. And I've gone through training that says, what should you look for when you're sitting down with a customer? The things that they say.
Does that.
I think that there are a lot of factors that come into play, and a lot of this is not always just down to a science. This is about how you're going, when you do get that meeting, you're having a conversation, and it's not like there's a formula for saying, how do you make friends in high school? It's like, well, you need to say this. And when they respond with this, then you say this. And next thing you know, you guys will be going out to a movie together. It's like, there are some things that you can do. And some of the articles I've read do have some interesting insight. They talk about things like psychographics and looking at their budgetary spend. And I don't discount these things. The problem that I have with looking at some of the things that they brought up in these articles is that getting that information is not always possible. It's like, well, take a look at their budgetary spend. It's like, oh yeah, me as an outside sales rep could just walk into Ed's new business and say, well, how much money did you spend on this stuff this past year? Because they're just going to tell me what they're spending their money on. So I'm just sitting here reading some of these articles, and it's like, okay, well, how do I get that information? It doesn't talk anything about the fact that it's like, yeah, you can't just walk into a business and expect them to give you that information. Now, on the other side of that, let's just use that example of budgetary spend as an example. Yeah, nobody's going to just tell me and give me their budget breakdown for the year and say, here's how much we're going to spend on this. You might get some clues. For example, let's just say you work for, a sales enablement platform, kind of like OneMob. There's our alluding for this. But you might be able to go to the company's website and look at, say, who they're hiring. If they're hiring a bunch of salespeople, then you might be able to deduce that there is some sort of initiative happening around sales. Maybe then is a good time to talk to them and say, I noticed that you're hiring a bunch of salespeople. I work for a platform that helps bring more sales enablement tools to any business. And I would love to show you a little bit of what I can do to help the new salespeople that you're bringing on board hit the ball, and take off running. So getting things like that budgetary spend and is not going to be just a straightforward process of asking for it, but you might be able to get some clues through research as to what kind of initiatives the business is taking. Things like their ecosystem. So, what kind of products do they have? Do they have products that mesh? Let's just stick with that sales enablement tool. Do they have other products that mesh with that? Have they invested in other tools? And this is information you may be able to get through a conversation. You can ask, say, like, hey, what are you using? What kind of tools are you using for your salespeople? They might tell you, well, we have a CRM for this. We have a social listening tool as well called this. And at that point, you can start to say, okay, they do invest in tools for their sales reps. So maybe they might be interested in investing in mine as well. And that might help you turn that customer into a paying customer when you demonstrate value as another piece of that sales ecosystem. Obviously, if they are willing to tell you about whether or not they're using a competitor's platform, if there's a contract renewal coming up, as long as that contract is not brand new, maybe you can insert yourself and say, hey, can I just show you exactly what our tool does in comparison to the tool that you're already using, and maybe how it differentiates itself. And if there's something, and if anything resonates with you, then we can have a deeper conversation about the next stages of implementing our platform. So if there's a contract renewal or a competitive product already being utilized at that company, then obviously the company is interested in products like yours, and you may be able to insert yourself inside that organization. And then the last one that a lot of people don't think about is whether or not there's like some kind of a merger or an acquisition happening. Mergers and acquisitions always mean change, naturally. A new company is acquiring an older one. And timing is very critical in here, but usually when mergers and acquisitions are taking place, there is a financial investment involved, and you might be able to insert yourself in that, with the acquiring company and say, hey, as you are continuing to build out, your brand into this business you're acquiring, perhaps there's a way for me to help out there and develop a process for you and for the sales team as they come into your new company. So there's mergers and acquisitions are a little bit tougher. I
Yeah.
have been successful with one or two of them in the past, but that's kind of a slippery slope because a lot of times people will just say, we just need to wait until everything's done. The dust is settled. There's a lot already happening. We don't have time or the energy to think about anything else right now. So come back to us when everything is complete.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't like going into mergers and acquisitions as much. The potential exists, but I wouldn't dive headfirst into one and say, well, no, and say, let me talk to you before this all finishes up. Usually it's a matter of wait for the dust to settle and then come back to them. And a lot of times, like after the dust has settled, people might be more willing to at least sit down with you. So
Absolutely.
as they start to understand more and more about what's happening and how the organization is going to have to work moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. All of those different things you kind of pointed at just really I think that does set the stage to know, hey, these people might buy from me. So let's move forward with building this relationship.
Yeah.
So when we know that they're ready to buy, what should we do to give them the best experience so that they make that decision to buy?
This just comes down to me as being a good person. Now I completely understand that salespeople have a lot happening all at one time. They're focused on quotas, they're focusing on making sure they've built pipeline and that they are they've got projects that are happening down the road to fill, they're trying to push, products, there's constant attention from upper management saying, where are you with this, and this? And it can get a little bit hard to manage all of those things at once. So I understand that stress is involved in sales, but at the end of the day, just like that car salesman I talked about before, this is just a matter of being being prompt, timing. If you say you're going to do something by a certain deadline, make sure you hit that deadline. Don't be late. Now, again, I understand that things pop up. You have families, things in your business life and your personal life can absolutely interfere. And as long as you as long as you are transparent with the person and saying, look, I know I gave you this deadline. I'm going to have a hard time hitting it because of some other things that are happening. Can we please push that to this? Usually people will be understanding unless there is a very specific reason they needed it by that particular deadline. Yeah. And usually they would make that clear to you up front, like I need it by this date because we're presenting it, the following day or something like that. So in those cases, you've got to be prompt no matter what. Stay up till midnight if you need to. But make sure that when the classic saying is, don't overcommit, and so make sure that you're not putting too much on yourself so that you can be punctual with the deadlines that you've set. Be relevant. Make sure that you are not going out to somebody trying to sell them a product or service that makes absolutely no fit for them. I'm not going to, I really can't think of a scenario right off the top of my head, but it's like, well, I think about the time I accidentally cold called like a suicide hotline.
Oh, I remember
trying to sell them IT services. And quite honestly, there was, you could joke about it and say there was some relevance there. Like, we'll sell them new, my boss came to me, he's like, well, did you try selling them some new phones? But make sure that when you are trying to reach out to somebody, that what you are offering is relevant to them. And it's not always they'll tell you if it makes no sense at the time, but when you do try to push for those conversations, you've got to make sure that what you're offering is of value to them. And so be relevant, be valuable. And if they tell you there's something that they really are not looking for in your platform, Don't try to push that. I've seen it before where somebody will say, well, I really need it for, a buyer will say, I need this particular product or service for these 3 reasons. And then a seller will gravitate towards a 4th reason their product is so good and completely skip over the 3 things that the buyer had said they were interested in. It's like, come on, guy. Like he literally gave you like A, B, and C as to what they need. Don't focus on something outside of those 3 things that they gave you. Give them what they want. Make sure you know your product. If you have to go, it is okay. I want to clarify that it is okay to say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll find it and give it to you. But if that is all you're saying in a conversation, and that was something that I struggled with very, very heavily when I first got into IT sales, is I would go out on a meeting, and if I didn't have like a sales engineer or somebody with me, then I would be just writing down the notes, the questions that they have, and saying, I'll take that back to my engineer. And it got to the point where it's like, wow, I really didn't know anything. I should have just emailed him, emailed the buyer before we met and said, what questions, what kind of things are you interested in looking at, so that I can determine which engineer is the right fit. And then, if you have questions or things that you really specifically need to focus in on, I can have our engineer prepped and ready for those conversations. But it's like, when I first got started in IT sales, I was going out on these meetings and I wouldn't know diddly squat. And I can guarantee you it felt like a huge waste of time for the buyer.
Yeah.
So make sure that you do know your product. And again, it's not bad to say that you don't know the answer to some questions, but it can't be all the questions, And then finally, I would just say differentiate yourself. Avoid generic pitches, because buyers do not want to be sold. They want to understand what makes you different from the other. You're not the only. I would guess that there's almost no product or service out there that has no competitors. There's somebody else out there who's selling what you're selling. The question is what you're going to do to set yourself apart from that competition. So making sure that you are avoiding generic pitches and not making it it doesn't sound like you're just going through a script. This is going back to that connection with a person and not a brand.
Absolutely.
If you give them the brand script, they're going to find out. They're going to notice. If you give them the personal script, I guess I'll call it, and say, and come across to them as a human who wants to really help them and understand their particular problems, then you're going to be in a much better place, because the generic brand script is going to just focus on the things that your product does well. But that, like we talked about with regards to relevance, maybe that's not the specific things and key pieces that the buyer is actually looking for. You need to make sure that you are adjusting and doing what you are, and adjusting to what their specific needs are, and helping them to understand that they are getting a differentiated product or service by working with you, because you're listening. You're not reading from a script.
So those are good things to think about, but what should we make sure to avoid doing so that we don't end the opportunity to provide that solution to their problem?
All right. If you're in sales, you've probably heard this at some point. It is the ABCs of sales. Always be closing.
Oh no.
Always be closing.
That makes me think of those rooms of people going, yeah.
Yes, I've been part of I did a very, very short stint with an organization that had those kind of like motivational things where it's like, this big crowd, like room, auditorium full of people, and it was just people in, it was some speaker up there talking about how much money you're going to make. I did not resonate at all with that mentality of you're going to be closing this many deals and you're going to be making 7-figure income. And I'm just sitting here going, oh, Lord. Like,
Yeah, it makes
you got people in, but you know what? You got people eating out of the palm of your hand because of the. And the thing is I found that with those, when you go, it's, you know, here's our tangent. I went to at least 2 of those things, you know, those big auditorium presentations, and it truly was nothing but people up there showing us everything they had. Their big house, their expensive car, you know, pictures of their family. I mean, people would just go up there and brag about all the stuff they have because they were successful in this job, and you're going to be successful too. But they never, I think there was one person out of the dozens I listened to who actually went up there and for like 10 minutes told us what he did to be successful. So out of the probably hours and hours and hours that I spent, you know, cumulatively listening to these at these events, like 10 minutes of it was educational, and the rest was listening to people talk about how much money they've made. And it was honestly, it was like, you know, other people were up there, you know, were out there cheering, and, you know, everybody was in the seat talking about what they were going to do with their money. Like, I had to listen to somebody next to me be like, oh man, when I'm making that, I'm going to buy a boat. And I'm just sitting here going, you're not going to make that. Like, it's, and maybe that's just the pessimist in me, but it's like, I know the turnover in this industry and in this particular organization.
You may tend to be more pessimistic and I'm more optimistic, but I'd still be in the same boat as you are. No pun intended. If you're not going to do the work, you're not going to receive that. So you can't focus on that. You've got to focus on the work.
Yes, but the problem was that they weren't telling us what needed to be done to generate that success. I just went to these things to listen to people to show me pictures of their big house. And so I found it to be incredibly belittling and such a waste of time. Anyway, there's our tangent. All of that aside, this is all coming back to this idea that we just always need to be closing deals. Closing deals make more money. And that mentality has the effect, especially on newer sellers, trying to push in the conversation, and it can become apparent to a buyer when somebody is focused on just asking questions that are trying to push them towards getting a signature. Mm-hmm. If a buyer even gets a whiff of this person doesn't care about anything but closing the deal, they're gonna push you aside. They'll just ghost you in an email and say, "Yes, this isn't the right fit."
Right. Absolutely.
In my experience, always be closing is a good goal to work towards. Closing deals is obviously important in sales, and you need to make sure that you have a process in place for closing the deal. But what we need to make sure that we're stressing is that you can't have that mentality in the middle of your conversations with buyers. Mm-hmm. It can't be at the forefront of your mind. It is the goal of the business organization. It is your goal as a sales rep to always be closing. But if you have that mindset, and if always be closing is in your head at the time of conversation, then you're not going to close it because it will come across to the buyer. So avoid thinking about closing the deal until, if you avoid thinking about closing the deal in the course of your conversation, my guess is you will close more deals because it will come across in your conversation.
That's true. And it comes to the position you take as a seller. Are you trying to provide a solution to people that need the solution, or are you trying to make money? And if you're only focused on making money, that's all about you. And that's that's just not beneficial in the long run for anybody.
Yeah.
If you're
So
only
I would say if
focused-
you are a sales coach, tell people about always be closing, but put it as it is an objective. It is not a sales. It's an objective, but it is not a strategy in the course of the selling process.
Right, right. So we've talked about helping to create a positive experience for a potential buyer and the
Mhm.
things to avoid. But at this point, we might have a portion of our audience thinking, okay, great. But how do I find that prospect that is ready to buy? And I would say that you need to know your ICP, get to some sales jargon here. And over in the UK, they say the customer avatar. But what that means is basically just the ideal customer. So when you're looking at that ideal customer and you're coming up with who that is, you just don't just look at what they do for work and the tools they use for their job. You need a bigger picture. And you kind of mentioned this before, real quick, in your list of things to look at is this psychographics, which is really fascinating to me. But what exactly are psychographics?
So psychographics is basically the study of a person's behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the shortest way for me to put it. It analyzes things like, their personality, how they react to stimuli from the world around them, their values, their attitude, opinions, interests, lifestyle. It's understanding the person you're speaking to and how you can come across as a more trustworthy person to that individual. And understanding psychographics, this is one of those things that becomes very difficult to teach. You'll hear all the time, and this is how I even got into IT sales, is that I was hired because of my personality, not because of my skill set.
Mm-hmm.
I had no expertise in and no experience in sales or IT when I started working. I got the job because I had a good persona. And this is where it becomes this is when you are trying to analyze psychographics in sales, this is the part where that will come with time and experience, but it's harder to teach, if that makes sense.
I think it goes back to building relationships if we want to be redundant here.
Yeah. See, that's one of those things that's hard. That's a harder skill set. It's hard to tell somebody. We talked about this concept of being a parent and saying, "Oh, well, if you want to be friends with that person, just ABC, and then then you'll be friends." It's like, no, that's not how it is. It's harder to teach somebody how to be. It's hard to teach an introvert to be an extrovert.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have or vice versa.
That's what makes it even more complicated.
Understanding psychographics, especially when it comes to sales and I kind of analyzing, that's just something that will come with time. But, that's also something that you've been developing since, you were a toddler.
Yeah, if you have friends.
Yeah. And you have been developing your own persona since the time you were born. And then you've been working since, you first went to first time you set foot in daycare or school, developing the ability to work and be around other people. So it's not something that is impossible for anybody. It's just something there's not like a science around it per se. It's something that you are just constantly developing and constantly doing.
Yeah, I agree. So let's specifically look at this as like what psychographic characteristics influence the buying behavior.
Well, if we were to just pick a few that let's just go through some of the ones I mentioned earlier. I don't want to go through them all because I feel like there are some that are a little bit redundant. But obviously, like personality, getting a sense for when you go out and meet with somebody. I think it's really important to understand that there tend to be stereotypes around people, especially based on what it is that they do. For example, when I first got into IT sales, I figured that every IT manager I would ever speak to would be this guy who sits in a room at a computer, nerd kind of guy. And that obviously wasn't the case. I found some very extroverted IT managers, people who just love talking. And it kind of shattered it shattered my perception of what the kind of people I thought I was going to be dealing with on a regular basis. And so I learned very, very quickly not to just assume that everybody fit a particular stereotype. So, I had to make sure that I understood and learned how to communicate with people of all different personalities, introverted, extroverted. Do they tend to be more, do they tend to think through their decisions, and be very intentional with every single decision that they make, or do they seem more impulsive? Getting an idea of how a buyer responds to the world around them can help you put on the particular persona that lets you come across as a more trustworthy individual. So, and you want to put yourself in that positive light. So make sure that you understand just what that person's characteristics are like, what their personality is like. The kinds of values that they have. So what constitutes right and wrong for a particular buyer? Are they motivated on things that seem more self-centered, or are they more focused on helping others and being empathetic? For instance, are they doing this for themselves? Are they buying because they want to experience some sort of personal benefit, or are they buying because they want a team within their organization to have it easier? What is the purpose for their buying? Attitudes and opinions. You're obvious at some point they're going to break away from the conversation of buying just to talk about some sort of something in the world. For example, there's been a lot of shift recently since COVID hit within the business community of this idea of work from home culture. Are they interested in, do they like the idea of the work from home culture? Or are they, you need to be in an office? If you sell a product or service that is very focused on remote workers, then you might have a hard time selling to somebody who's very focused on having their employees in an office or having their team in an office, and you may need to adjust. It's not impossible, but you just may need to adjust how you present your solution to them. Interests, that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, I think it's pretty classic. If you've ever been in sales, I think at least once you probably asked if somebody enjoys golf or going to the movies. They want movie tickets, or if they like a particular sports team, maybe you can give them tickets to a game, depending on what your budget is for stuff like that. Obviously, helping if they tell you that they're interested in something, maybe you can help them to experience that interest as part of the conversation. Now, on the other side of that, be extremely careful when you do things like that, because that can come across as being sold. If you're saying, oh man, let me get you tickets to this game and let's go out and play golf. I'll buy everything for you. We can go get drinks as well. It's like they will get a sense of, this person's just trying to give me everything so that I'm going to, sign a contract no matter what. I mean, just be careful with how much you offer on that. It's not bad to utilize some of those tools, but just make sure that you are aware that that can also have negative connotations with it as well. So the psychographics are really just, those are things that that you've been developing since you were walking. You've been developing yourself. Where you go taking those to the next level is when you start to understand and you make adjustments based on who you are speaking to. And how, and kind of being the chameleon, I think is was something that somebody said to me once, is if you are if you are dealing with somebody who loves to talk, then let them talk. And then when it's your turn, you can talk too. And, find some common ground and then just get into this really nice chat session about whatever. If you are dealing with somebody who's very, very reserved and tends to just want to be on point and not go off on tangents like I tend to do, then make sure that you are staying on point.
Yeah.
Don't go off on talking about experience, your other experiences. If they say, I want to just get through this, let's just get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, then make sure you're doing that. So that's kind of where the next level of psychographics comes into play in the business community. Is you've spent your whole life developing yourself. Now, when you get into the business and say, especially in sales, is the need for you to be able to analyze other people and shift your persona to be more accommodating towards the buyer's persona.
I think you're starting to allude to a future podcast, because that's that concept of mirroring somebody, and that's a deep psychological concept.
There's a chance we might be talking about this on a later podcast.
Maybe. So we're coming to the end of our time here. Our classic question here: is there anything else or final thoughts you want to share?
Well, we said at the very beginning that we were going to be, advertising or promoting.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's still early.
Right?
We're going to be promoting something coming up. So here is that promotion. If you are listening to this before November 9th, 2022, I would encourage you to check out this free webinar that's going to be coming up that OneMob and our CEO is going to be participating in. It's called the 5 Hacks of Revenue Growth for 2023. So it's going to be looking at things that you can do as a business owner or maybe, a team leader to help grow the business in 2023. It's going to be talking about modern sales practices. There will be a number of things that we talked about on this particular podcast, but they will be going into a little bit more detail, and also be, talking about some other concepts that we did not discuss in this particular session. So if you are, interested in continuing and getting some insight into how to continue to grow your business for 2023 and some of the trends that we're seeing, then I would absolutely encourage you to check out this webinar. Again, it's called the 5 Hacks for Revenue Growth in 2023. Our CEO, Safi Hillier, will be participating. It's on November 9th, 2022. Definitely check this out because it's going to be some fantastic content.
Yeah, and we'll stick the link to register for that down in our description here of the podcast. So if you didn't notice that description before you started listening, go click over to that and get registered and join that. And we thank you for joining us today. Again, this is David and Mason with OneCast. See you guys later.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks for listening to OneCast with your hosts David Beaucamp and Mason Toothman. We hope you enjoyed our tips on growing revenue. Join us next week to hear an interview with the founder and CEO of OneMob, Safi Hillier, as he reveals OneMob's origin and future. Subscribe to our podcast and thank our sponsor by going to onemob.com and signing up for free to start your journey into better communication. That is all for this episode.